Hi, my name is Steve Lozier. I'm an education specialist in the Metropolitan School District of Wayne Township, focused on the planning and implementation of project-based learning units in our schools. This module is one of many designed to help teachers better understand project-based learning and design and develop PBL units to engage and challenge their students. This presentation is available to you by following the link in the My Big Campus bundle, as well as the Google folder associated with it. I'd suggest you open that presentation in another tab, as you may want to pause this video and click on a link or resource in the presentation to explore further. Please note that if you're new in building your knowledge of PBL, this video would be considered the sixth in the sequence. So our objectives for this module: I'll understand how PBL units seek to balance the assessment picture of student learning. Understand how PBL units must assess each individual student's ability to apply and use content, knowledge, and skills, must assess their growth in the unit, and then also assess their growth in the 21st century skills. And then I'll examine rubrics and their use in PBL. So assessment's kind of the elephant in the room in our profession right now in terms of the way that it is tied to accountability. One of the things when I do PD like this, I like to make the point that in terms of the way assessments have been tied to our pay, often in the state of Indiana at least, is that the profit motive can get disconnected from the purpose motive, to borrow an idea from Daniel Pink. So we have to remember that the assessment piece and those forms are to assess student learning and student growth, and we must be accurate and do that with fidelity without getting conflicted by the fact that the profit motive in terms of the grades and student performance that can then be tied to our pay get in the way and cause some conflict in that. So one of the points that is often made in talking about assessment in a PBL context is the fact that you can still use traditional assessments in a PBL unit. So this kind of comes back to that idea of profit and purpose motive a little bit too. So when asking teachers often to implement and talking about the standardized testing or the accountability measures that we're tied to, I think by default teachers think about two things. They think about a target of standardized measures and evaluation, and then they think about career and college readiness. They think about the 21st century skills. They think about why they got into teaching in general, which is for oftentimes lifelong learning, and those sort of things. And they put those two targets in their minds and put them like this, so they kind of polarize those. With PBL, what we need to do is to unite or align, excuse me, those two targets. So we need to trust, and this is a leap of faith, I fully acknowledge that we have to shoot for career and college readiness, shoot for lifelong learning, shoot for those sort of things, but we also can't discount the fact that standardized measures and evaluation are a part of the process. However, with PBL, by engaging students at such a high level and with such rigorous tasks in a PBL context, they hit the further target, and in the process they can hit the standardized target. What we have to do is ensure that students transfer to both contexts. So what I'm talking about here in terms of assessment is in PBL units, we want to use assessments that look like standardized measures. We want to use assessments that are multiple choice. But we also want to teach students how to critically think about multiple choice questions and think about those testing situations and those scenarios and transfer what are the content and knowledge that they get in a PBL context that's very real and relevant and at a high level back to the context of maybe a standardized testing format. So we have to keep those sort of things in mind. We need to consider that traditional assessment weights the pendulum here in one direction, and what we do to try to balance that is to bring in the 21st century skills, because we know that student success beyond our institutions really depends largely on their ability to use and develop and grow their 21st century skills. So things like communication, collaboration, critical thinking, empathy, grit, those sort of things we know lead to success beyond the formal educational context, and we must acknowledge that we must teach those, we must assess those in our classrooms. So to that end, here's some examples of assessments that can evaluate 21st century skills, and these come from BIE. So you can just kind of see what are some options there that you may consider becoming standard practices in your PBL unit. So in a PBL unit, 21st century skills are explicitly taught and assessed or encouraged by project work, but not taught or assessed. So you need to determine what of those 21st century skills are you going to actually design mini lessons or workshops around, and then assess students' skills of those throughout the unit, and which ones are students maybe going to use to complete the unit, but they're not necessarily as focused upon. This slide has a link to a video on assessing 21st century skills, and in the video you're going to see a new tech tool that they use that's digital to assess 21st century skills. So I'm going to ask that you think a little bit flexibly here and think about how could you use the concept of this in your classroom, knowing that you may not have the technical tool, the software tool, to evaluate 21st century skills. So feel free to pause it here and click on that video. Another thing in terms of assessment is to also think about how to balance group and individual assessment. And one of the things I think PBL gets a bad rap for sometimes is that it relies too heavily on group work and group assessment. Remember that all teaching needs to point to an individual student's ability to apply and use those knowledge to meet those standards, and if we're not assessing students' performance relative to those standards individually, then that's a dangerous place to be in. So you need to keep that in mind. Here are some examples of formative and summative assessments, and this corresponds with the project planning form that we'll use to explore some of these. So you can see traditional ones here and other ones that help in terms of during and the end of the project assessments. And here's an example of a rubric. What I'd want to note here is you have content knowledge and the way that it's weighted there in the first row. But then there's also on the rubric 21st century skills. So how are those assessed, and what are they worth within the project? Schools, and I would check with your administrator or your school about this, but schools have sometimes taken a stance on what percentage of a student's grade can be tied to 21st century skills. That's going to vary from building to building, so you're going to need to check on that. But you also want to ensure that students' assessments indicate their content learning based on those standards. So that's just an example. I'll note there are other rubrics in the folder, the Google folder for this module as well. I'm going to take a minute and click on the link here to see the assessment, how to plan an assessment. This is from BIE as well. And then finally, assessment is a conversation. So what role do you want students to play in assessment? And this is where PBL holds a ton of power. So we often have been taught about assessment of learning, which is summative assessment. We've been taught about assessment for learning, or maybe during learning, which is formative assessment. There's also assessment as learning, right? So that's where you have students assessing themselves, assessing their peers, and having conversations with you about, as the teacher, about their progress. So conversations about where am I currently, where do I need to get, and then how do we close that gap. So how do you bring students into that assessment conversation? Well, you can consider them developing the rubrics. You can make them part of the research, so have them research how is this work evaluated in the real world and bring that into the assessment piece. You're going to find, especially if you do have students create their own rubrics, that students often set the bar at a much higher level and hold each other much more accountable than maybe you would as a teacher. And then think about, could students or groups evaluate each other at certain milestones as opposed to you, and make that selective choice. We'll look at some of that a little bit more in depth when we talk about groups. So finally, in terms of assessments, you need to think about what products and presentation pieces do you see fitting with that unit idea you've developed now into a driving question. Maybe where that authentic audience partner, they could be a resource for guiding you toward a product and presentation piece. And then consider here how you capture that on this form, to think about the formative and summative assessments at the end of the unit that you want to use. And so in the way this is structured is that you can check those and then provide some elaboration there in that other column. You may also want to pre-assess content or background knowledge or skills before you launch to know how to plan. So this concludes our exercises in examining PBL and assessment. And if you're following these modules in sequence, the next one is PBL, leveraging student groups and teaching collaboration. In that module, you're going to think about how to best structure student groups and teach collaboration in your unit. Thank you.